Bismillah, alhamdulillah, salatu wassalam ala rasulillah. A lot of people have asked me to comment on the recent podcast where Jordan Peterson interviews Muhammad Hijab. And overall, I think the interview was very interesting. I think it was a good conversation. I'm very happy that Jordan Peterson, as a prominent public intellectual, had this conversation with a believing Muslim, because oftentimes with the mainstream media and public intellectuals, they are averse to talking to real believing Muslims who profess the values of Islam. Instead, you see a lot of extremists on mainstream media supposedly representing Islam, or on the other end of the spectrum, complete deviants and even ex-Muslims trying to represent Islam. So having someone like Muhammad Hijab, who is a prominent da'i, who is on YouTube, in this situation is very good, and I was very happy about it. I think the conversation really spurred a lot of thoughts for me that I want to share with you. But before we get into that, I want to say that the best part of the conversation for me was the recitation of the Quran by Muhammad Hijab. I think it's great for Jordan Peterson to have heard the Quran recited to him and his followers as well. I think the other really good aspect of the conversation was that Muhammad Hijab expressed that he would like it and he would be happy if Jordan Peterson became Muslim. I think that is something that often goes missed in these types of conversations with non-Muslims, where the supposed da'i or Muslim speaker will talk about the beauty of Islam, talk about how Islam is rational and compelling, but they won't actually invite the interlocutor or the interviewer or whoever to Islam. But Muhammad Hijab actually does that. He actually invites Jordan Peterson and says or expresses his desire for Jordan Peterson to become Muslim. So that's all great stuff. Now, my own thoughts about Jordan Peterson, independent of this interview podcast, is that he is kind of a disappointing figure. I, in the past, have said that Muslims should be willing to engage with Jordan Peterson or be receptive to some of his critiques, specifically his critiques of feminism, his critique of the downfall of masculinity in the modern world. I think these were good critiques that he made, good ideas, but ultimately he didn't really go far enough. And his thought, I think, has stagnated over the past 3 or 4 years, where he's not really going to the roots of these issues when it comes to feminism, modernism, liberalism, secularism. It's probably because he is not able to get to the roots of those issues, and so he's not really rocking the boat. He's not really bringing some of these more intellectual or penetrating critiques of the modern malaise. So even with his rise to prominence, like if you don't know Jordan Peterson's background, what made him go viral was his refusal to be forced to use someone's preferred pronouns. So it was an LGBT issue. He took a hard stance. He said, no one can force me to use someone else's preferred pronouns. And so this seems like he is taking on LGBT, but in reality, he wasn't taking on LGBT. This was a free speech issue for him. He has expressed elsewhere that he's fine with using people's preferred pronouns. He thinks that's the appropriate or nice thing to do. He just doesn't want a law, like Canadian law, because he's Canadian, to force him to use people's preferred pronouns. So it was like a free speech issue. So even on that thing that made him go viral and brought him into the public spotlight, his criticism or his critique is not really that deep. And I did not see that for what it was in the past, even when I made one video about Jordan Peterson. And now, over time, I've gained clarity on exactly what he is promoting and what he's not. Also, he's not really that religious of a Christian. He's, you know, kind of watered down, as unfortunately for Christianity, a lot of Christians today are, especially in Canada. So there's not even that kind of connection that Muslims could have when it comes to a deep practice or deep belief in a tradition. Jordan Peterson seems to be post-tradition, post-Christian tradition, and that's very clear from the way that he talks when he's engaging, especially when he's engaging with non-Christians. But even, you know, in his podcast, in his debates, he's not really bought in fully like other Christians that you might see on YouTube or elsewhere. And I think actually that's part of his ability to have broken into the mainstream. Because related to the point I made about Muslims, like it's either complete extremists, terrorists, or it's deviants, I think there's a similar thing happening with Christianity as well. And so Jordan Peterson, part of the reason that he's covered to some extent is that he is able to play the role of an academic and, oh, I'm just, you know, thinking about these ideas in Christianity and theology, and it's all very academic, and it puts religion at a distance. Like, oh, of course, no person would be a traditional Christian. Like, no civilized person in the modern world with all our technology could be a traditional, you know, Bible thumping Christian or Quran believing Muslim in this kind of full-fledged confessional way. I think Jordan Peterson shares that kind of outlook on religion, and it became clear within this podcast, as we'll talk about. So, despite Jordan Peterson being kind of this more academic, watered-down type of Christian, which with very qualified critique of LGBT or qualified critique of feminism, it's still very shocking that he is considered a Nazi by the social justice left. Basically, the type of perspective that Jordan Peterson has today is what, you know, the most left-wing Democrats within U.S. politics or liberals within Canadian politics would have had 7 years ago or 8 years ago. But now the discourse has become so extreme, and the social justice left has become so extreme that they would denounce the progressive left wing of 8 years ago as being analogous to Hitler, or literally being Hitler, as they'd say. So this is, I'm sure that there are a lot of Muslims who are very, very upset that any Muslim would talk to Jordan Peterson, because they think that Jordan Peterson is this crazy Nazi, right-wing, alt-right, who wants to do whatever, and these people should be deplatformed. These people should be boycotted. I'm sure, and I've seen some of these left-wing progressive Muslim activists and academics actually state this kind of view against Jordan Peterson. So I think that that's silly and quite foolish. But at the end of the day, what is Jordan Peterson really offering? I think that's a question that we can ask and we can investigate. A lot of the podcast was about specifying the basics of Islam. And my personal approach when it comes to this is, when it comes to the basics, it should just be kept basic. You know, one of the biggest selling points of Islam is that our theology is very clear. It's very clear, it's very straightforward, it's not complicated. You bring a Christian or Jordan Peterson himself to try to explain Christian theology, I mean, you'll need, you know, a lifetime of study to try to understand the basic core tenets of Christian theology and their understanding of God and their understanding of history and so forth. Same thing with Judaism, same thing with Hinduism. All of these religions, their theology is extremely complicated. They're accessing that theology is very complicated for a variety of reasons. But Islam is very easy to access. And as I've said before, this makes Islam easy to criticize, because anyone can go and in a short amount of time learn the basics of Islam, be able to access the textual tradition of Islam, because it's all translated, it's all there, accessible by the search engine. So this makes Islam a source of, it makes it an easy target for the armchair amateur critic. Whereas other religions, you have to go get a PhD in theology to be able to grasp their notion of God and therefore critique it. But the benefit is that people are entering Islam because they see the religion as the truth, they experience it as the truth, it resonates with them. And so if you're communicating the basics of Islam, I'd say just stick to, for example, the hadith of Hadith Jibril, where the angel Gabriel alayhi comes in the form of a human being to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and asks, what is Iman? What is belief? What is Islam? What is Ihsan? These three questions, and then the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam explains. I think that gives a good summary of what Islam is, what it means to believe, the pillars of Iman, Allah, the angels, the divine books of revelation, the messengers throughout time, the day of judgment, and Qadar of Allah, the divine decree of Allah. Also Islam, the Shahada, testifying that there's no object or no God worthy of worship other than Allah. Salah, Zakat, fasting, and Hajj. So, and ihsan, the spiritual element of excellence in one's worship. Worship Allah as if you see Him, and since you can't see Him, know that He sees you. So this is very simple, can be expressed and can be elaborated as needed in a conversation. So some of the ideas that Jordan Peterson talked about and Muhammad Hijab discussed, it seemed to... Jordan Peterson clearly had some big assumptions, and those assumptions are things that we should critique. So, for example, he asked at one point, can there be peace between Christians and Muslims? And when he's asking this of Brother Muhammad, I'm thinking, like, what are you talking about? Like, what are you talking about? Like, peace between Christians and Muslims? The whole world is being destroyed by this liberal, secularist, transhumanist agenda. And it's eating all of us alive. Christian, Muslim, Jew, Buddhist, non-Muslim, non-theist. All of us are victims of this project. And whether Muslims and Christians can get along in the future is irrelevant if there are no Muslims and Christians left in the future, because all religion has been wiped out, all belief has been wiped out, all traditions have been wiped out by this hegemony, this monoculture that is being forced on the entire globe. So, or what if humanity as we know it is wiped out? Okay, so that's the elephant in the room. That's the main thing that Jordan Peterson just takes for granted, and instead he frames things in this kind of, classical liberal atheist perspective, like, the world would just be such a great place if all the religions would get along. And this is to distract from the liberal hegemony, the control of the liberal secular state on all of humanity, forcing us into becoming these atomized individuals, just completely dependent on the state for life, and marriages being destroyed, families are being destroyed, communities are being destroyed all over the world, and ultimately even the human being itself, because of technology, because of transhumanism and gene editing and VR and uploading your consciousness to the web and all of these new technologies that are going to fundamentally reshape and ultimately destroy humankind. Like, that is really the main problem that we have, not whether Christians and Muslims are getting along. I don't know any Muslim nation, actually, that is operating on Islamic principles that is posing a threat to any Christian anywhere in the world. Like, that's just in the imagination of, you know, some of these evangelicals. So it's surprising for Jordan Peterson to kind of repeat these tropes and not acknowledge this bigger situation. And he can't acknowledge it because his fundamental position as an intellectual is as a classical liberal. You know, he's a classical liberal. So his ideal is this kind of liberal world order. He's just not able to put two and two together, that it is exactly all of the problems that we see in the modern world is because of all the major problems are because of this liberal order. What was established, you know, by the Enlightenment thinkers and all of these philosophers from John Stuart Mill to Thomas Jefferson and whoever else, where they are creating this liberal order, that is going to lead to a certain conclusion. They laid the roots of the destruction of marriage, the destruction of family, the atomization of society. That was all laid down by the Enlightenment thinkers, these classical liberals, and we are living in the consequences of that philosophy. We are living in that philosophy taken to its logical conclusion, because if you maximize freedom for an individual and you say that individual rights are the most important thing, and the state has to protect those rights at all costs, well, that's going to lead to an individualistic, atomized world. And people are going to have to prefer, and the state will allow them to prefer their own individual interests over, you know, sacrificing for the sake of a wife or a husband, sacrificing for the sake of children, sacrificing for your community, and saying that, well, I'm not the most important thing. This community is the most important thing, or God is the most important. My religion is the most important thing. Sometimes you have to sacrifice your own individual rights for the sake of this greater good, or the greatest good. Anyway, this is something that I've discussed in many other videos, but the point being that Jordan Peterson's classical liberalism is part of the problem, so of course he's not going to diagnose the problem with the world accurately. Also, Peterson is talking about we need to address the problem of evangelical religion. So again, that's coming from his classical liberal view that, you know, the only thing that can be evangelicized, the only thing that can be spread by force throughout the world, it's the liberal world order. Spread democracy, spread individual liberty, spread human rights, spread this human rights regime. That force being used to implement that kind of moral order, the liberal moral order, that is justified. That is justified according to classical liberals. And if you pressed Jordan Peterson on this, he would have to concede. You just ask him that, well, are you in favor of a United Nations that is going to put sanctions on countries that don't respect individual freedoms and is going to pressure countries to abide by, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and whatever that we have in this human rights doctrine? Are you in favor of a UN, a United Nations that will enforce that or pressure, coerce that? And he'll ultimately say yes, because he's not a nihilist. He believes in morality, and that's his morality. So why should that be the only form of morality that is allowed to be spread and be evangelical and be imposed? Why? Who set this kind of rule that it's only liberalism? So this is something that Jordan Peterson doesn't question, he doesn't critique. And that's why he has a problem with Islam or with Christianity being, or any religion being evangelical and spreading or being expansionist. But there really shouldn't be a problem here. It shouldn't be a problem for someone who claims to be a Christian. Unfortunately, all of these Christians and Jews, also liberal Jews, they have lost this idea of establishing God's moral order on earth. Muslims are the only ones who understand the importance of establishing God's moral order. It doesn't mean forcing everyone on earth to believe in God or to believe in Islam. But when you establish the moral order, it means that God's will has been done on the earth. God's will in establishing God's laws on earth. That's the only way to have true justice. That is the only way to have true submission and devotion to God. And these concepts existed in Judaism, in Christianity, but all of that has been lost because of, their reformations and because of liberalization. And they're not even aware of what they've lost and how incoherent their beliefs are now as liberal supposed Christians, liberal supposed Jews, or whatever. Muslims are the only ones who are really standing up to this secularization, modernization of the modern world. And this also came up when Jordan Peterson asked Muhammad Hijab about what is the driving force of Islam to spread and expand. Well, the driving force of Islam to spread, again, is to establish God's moral order and ultimately to save humanity. And this is the kind of imagery that the Prophet ﷺ uses, that you have this pit of fire and humanity is rushing to dive into this pit of fire, and the Prophet ﷺ and the believers have to try to prevent people and stop them. Like, look, you're going to be diving into a pit of fire. We want to stop you from that. That is the driving force. And I think that Muhammad Hijab mentioned or alluded to that. He mentioned it, and I think that was good as well. Jordan Peterson also at one point said that we all have blood on our hands. We all have to contend with that. I don't think that we should agree. I don't think Muslims, we have blood on our hands. Again, the kind of war and expansion that is prescribed in Islam is perfectly rational and is perfectly consistent with believing that Islam is correct and believing in Islam and believing in morality. All of those things are rationally consistent. The Muslim is very consistent on all of it. It's only those Christians or Jews who have been liberalized in the sense that they've adopted this classical liberalism and liberal notions of tolerance, which are incoherent. It's only if you accept that liberalism that you have problems and you start looking at your own history and your own tradition as highly problematic, as barbaric. I have problems with Christianity in terms of its theology. That doesn't mean that I have a problem with the fact that Christianity is expansionist in and of itself. The problem that I have as a Muslim is that it's expanding falsehood. It is spreading falsehood. That's the problem. But I don't have a problem with the spreading itself per se. So this is what it means to be consistent. This just more evidence of Jordan Peterson's classical liberalism and how he can't be described as traditional in any sense or conservative in any sense. Overall, I hope that more Muslims will be able to engage with these public intellectuals. I think that as long as we are very straightforward about what Islam is and what Islam offers, I think that people like Jordan Peterson or his followers at least, they'll be receptive to that message. We have to present Islam as the solution to the modern world's problems because it clearly is the solution. And if more people were aware of this, then more people would accept Islam, and they would accept it with very open hearts and feeling the kind of mercy and guidance that is found within Islam. So as opposed to people who are misled about what Islam is, because they've been made to think that, oh, Islam is consistent with feminism, Islam is consistent with liberalism, Islam is Islam is consistent with liberalism, Islam is consistent with secularism. They come into Islam with these false notions, and then when they realize, oh, I guess Islam is not liberal, Islam is not consistent with these secular ideologies, then they become disillusioned, or some of them even leave the faith. So we have to be very clear about all of these things when we do da'wah. So may Allah reward Brother Muhammad Hijab for his da'wah and for what he did on this podcast, and may Allah guide us all. Ameen.
السلام عليكم. لا تنسوا الإعجاب بالفيديو والاشتراك في القناة تشجيعا لنا لنستمر بنشر المزيد إن شاء الله.